what are the biggest risks you see with personalization?
I'm super skeptical to anyone who suggests segmentation. These segmentation thoughts that we have from advertising disturbs the whole way of thinking about personalization.
This is Christoph Schmitz, who works at Schibsted, where he leads Curate, the content recommendation system shaping what millions of readers see and what they don't.
So what happened was that when we added these demographic data, the model performed worse. We added bias. By adding more data, we added a bias to it.
If you look at your audience as a whole, very often happens that the majority is where you look at in terms of the data.
That has a bias because our biggest user group is a very dominant one. This means that particularly young users, they rarely get to see journalism that engages them.
When you hear the word personalization, what does that actually mean to you?
Well, to me, it's a one-to-one relationship. So I try to distinguish between segmentation and personalization. So it's something that sort of is defined by an unique experience for you based on either some preferences that you've set or based on your user history.
And by user history, we could assume by the hockey sticks in the background that you have an interest for more hockey content than others.
Well, it could be sort of on a topic level, definitely. We have some ways of doing that in Schibsted, but if I would have been grouped as a person who likes hockey, that would be segmentation because it's kind of rule-based and puts me into a box. But if it is because I've read lots of articles that by coincidence was about hockey, but there are also relevance to other types of stories or there are other topics mentioned as well, then that would be like the top tier personalization.
For those listening now and hearing you for the first time, who are you, Christoph, and what is your role when we're talking about personalization in an editorial perspective and when it comes to editorial content?
I work in Schibsted Media. I'm the PM for product manager for a team called Curate. And we do the content recommendation system in Schibsted. It's an editorial tool. It's what we use to curate the content on the front pages from the editorial side. So it's a tool that the newsroom uses to sort of put the articles in the top of the page, edit the titles, edit the images, do that type of manual curation. But the manual curation that they do goes into the content recommendation system as an input because they also provide the editorial signals. And yes, they do say like, right, on position number 2, this story should be seen by everyone. So that's a signal that goes into the content recommendation. And then we do automation because we do like ranking on stories, how well they perform by different types of metrics and use cases. And then we apply personalization on top of that. So there are some basics that you and I would share as users. And then based on our reading history or other things that we would kind of know, we can adjust sort of that ranking so that we remove what you've read. But if we have some stories that or a topic that is kind of similar, that we follow in a kind of similar way, your score would influence my score sort of on that way as well. So that's how we do personalization and how we work with that. So it kind of goes the whole way from the newsroom, their input, what's important for them, how they get to expose the content of the journalism that they write, make sure that it reaches the broad audience or the narrow audience, depending on the story and the journalism. to sort of the engineering and the data science part. Yeah, so it's kind of a broad team and scope.
But then for me, it almost sounds like you started talking about you had, for example, almost segmentation, which you have very rule-based. But then you're also talking about the models in this, which is almost figuring out where do I position depending on my preferences and so on. Would you say that the evolution of this has been a little bit moved away from the rule-based over to the model figuring out where I am, or where do you sort of strike the balance between the two?
It's a very good question, and we actually discussed that same thing just last week, because I mean I've been doing this since 2016 ish, in the media industry, and it's basically the same things that we want to achieve now as it was then. We want to make sure that people buy a subscription, they get offered the right content, or journalism again, that makes them interested in spending their money and becoming subscribers, because that's the business model into this, right? We want to make sure that the journalism that we write about is being seen and sort of reaches the target audience and reaches the public, because it's supposed to make a public impact. We have different users with different needs, different frequencies. So we want to remove stories that you've read, because you don't need to see them anymore. We can give you something else instead, right? So there's different layers, or we can say that it's even a ladder that will climb on. So we'll start with the basic automation. Next floor is probably simple segmentation, because some is better than none, right? So if we can do something here, it's better. But that kind of leaves us into a different problem, because then we have these editorial biases and these presumptions that this is something that a man would like and this is something that a woman would like. And that's a big no-go for me when it goes into journalism, right? Because we want to make sure that it's non-biased, that if you happen to be man 75, interested in pop music, of course you should get the story about some pop star's breakdown, even though you're man 75, right? And sort of the editorial perception would be that this is not of interest for an old man, right? So then the next level would be to make some models or go directly on your passive or reading, giving you passive personalization based on your reading habits, because that's where the true thing is. And in between here, you probably have some active personalization again. So you can say, yes, I would like more news about foreign affairs, politics, culture. But then when you're overexposed to those topics and you don't really engage with them, we can see that, yeah, we probably would give you something else instead. So that kind of, because that's where the truth is. It's what do you consume? What don't you consume? And then, of course, you can influence sort of, I would like to consume more, but that's a different question than the personalization part. So the short answer is there's a ladder, same things we want to solve today as before, and sort of depending on how advanced will be, the better it will get.
Yeah, and I think also just something as simple as removing something you already read, because this is if you manually, let's say you curate the homepage, or in Nordics, as we say, the front page. What often is that if you see the same thing, you want some new perspectives on the different things. But then to listeners, one of the things that before this podcast, one of the things to prepare for this, I read, for example, the case study that you done on INMA, where you talk about fairness and distribution of where personalization actually can distribute more fair content also to them. But then in what you talked about now is different models. And one of the models that you talked about in your latest case study on INMA, which I recommend all of the listeners to read, is you talk about collaborative filtering, and that's one of the models you're working with. I also heard about the contextual models, multi-arm bandits. There are multiple models that's used here, but in general, like, can you explain this model to us? Let's start with, for example, collaborative filtering, and why is it a good model? And maybe also, do you see any bad things about it? Does it have any negatives as well?
So first of all, what we do is sort of we combine these different ways of scoring the articles. So we score all of the articles on an average. So we say looking at all of our users, this article gets lots of reading time, it gets it get few quick exit, it get lots of clicks, high CTR. So sort of we score how their overall performance is. That has a bias problem because our biggest user group is a very dominant one, and the next two is also quite large, and they share the same interests. This means that particularly young users, men and female, and sort of the second youngest female group, they rarely get to see journalism that engages them because it's not within the interest scope of older men, which is our biggest group. Yes, there are some news here that is important for all, so let's keep those aside because they are handled manually. Everyone get to see them. This is sort of what makes sure that we get an overall high engagement from our users. So what we do then is that we apply different other ways of calculating those scores, and to do that, we've started to use machine learning models. One of the models that is still blowing me away 3 years after we started to explore it is the collaborative filtering model. What it does is that it takes all impressions that we have on the front page. So we track everything that the users get in stream, and then we track what they click on. And that's all the model knows. Of course, it knows who. So there's a who gets to it and who clicks as well. And that is all it knows. Based on that data, we actually can paint out quite detailed maps of what content or journalism interests who. And what happens then is that we see, for example, that the story, let's take Erling Braut Haaland, he just bought a new private jet. That could be of interest for someone reading Premier League, could be of interest for someone who's just interested in football, could be interesting for someone who is interested in personal economics, could also be interesting for someone who is interested in celebrity news. If there's even a quote from his girlfriend about the conveniences, that will probably attract some additional users in this as well. However, if we from the editorial side would say this is about Erling Braut Haaland, this is Premier League, we would miss lots of users because sort of the context here is one-dimensional, but it gives a multi-dimensional context of relevance, which is unseen in our end before. And we see examples when we do these tests on our users that female users, for example, we find the sports articles that are very relevant for them. And my wife, for example, when she looks at Aftenposten, she goes and says, all right, Aftenposten actually has some sports articles that's related, that are relevant for me. And I like, yeah, what kind of stories do you find relevant that you get high on your homepage when you write it? Well, it's about kids sports. So if we'd done it like on an interest-based and segment-based, she would never you would never get sort of those stories because they're written by the sports journalists, they're tagged as sports, but they're not actually about sports. When she reads it, it's about something else. And that's the beauty of these things. This model particular doesn't know what the story is about. There's no tags, there's no nothing. It's just readers who are similar to you or have the same pattern, that has read almost the same articles as you. They have a high engagement score on this article. We think that this is also relevant for you. And then there's multiple dimensions in this, and sort of no user is the same. So there's this whole thing of categorizing and putting users into boxes and articles into boxes is like gone away. So the thing that really blew us away was when we tried to add segment data, so demographic data to it. Some of that data is predicted data. So we have a different system that does predictions and it gives a score. And some users, they say that they are man, female, sort of the age group and so on. So what happened was that when we added this demographic data, the model performed worse. We added bias. By adding more data, we added a bias to it, but still it was better than the prediction model to predict which users were male or female, just by looking at that and taking a completely different approach to it. So that model is like our bread and butter. The downside of it is that it requires quite a lot of data. It has sort of cold start issues because it needs to be retrained. It's a bit costly. It's hard to scale. It doesn't fit like our future business cases so well. So we need to rethink how we do that in the future. But that's a model that has opened a lot of doors in Schibsted, and sort of in the newsroom also started to shift how we think about personalization and what it's really about. And that's what I think is so amazing.
But I also think that one of the things that you started off with, which makes sense for me when we do personalization, is that if you look at your audience as a whole, what very often happens that the majority is where you look at in terms of the data. And a use case that, for example, I see is that if you look at age for a lot of subscribers in the news industry, maybe not for Schibsted, for many, they will be older of age. And if you look at data as a whole, you then maybe tailor to the majority. But I think one of the things that you said in the case study is that by enabling this sort of way of working, you're also creating fairness, because you're able to also then cater to, for example, what everybody else is in the industry is looking at. How do we cater to the young audience? And by having something that indicates the group, it can also then look into similarities of it. But then I also think there is good that you sort of some of the limitations it can have, because if you identify a group, you have bias with it. So I think it's a little bit testing here, like which group do you then identify the model towards working? Um, I I have a little bit of a story on sort of the person. You started in 2016, and I was way earlier than me. But back in the days, I was part of a Norwegian company called Seasons, that was acquired by Piano in, I think, 2019. And Seasons was really, really early on doing personalization and focusing on enable collaborative filtering, contextual targeting, and there were some really cool use cases for it. But I look back at that company, and it's sort of, at that time, nobody was sort of ready for personalization. I know you have some of it, and not to discuss sort of seasons as a whole, but then I think this has a little bit with timing. Do you think it's the last years this sort of matured, how we think about personalization? Or like, what's the advancement that is then making now that publishers are really looking into this as an area?
I mean, I've faced a lot of the same. We actually worked with previous job I had. We actually worked a bit with seasons, and you're absolutely right. There was a lot of things that was way before its time. really, really smart. I think some of the questions that we were struggling with then, we're still getting from like the
Mm.
newsroom. So there has definitely been a maturity in the newsrooms, and sort of the larger part of the newsrooms have understood that we need to solve this somehow, because this one size fits all way of publishing news that we have done doesn't work that well. So I like working with the newsrooms, understanding coming with some technology, and identify and show that you understand the publishing questions, the journalism, the publishing purpose, the limitations, the understanding the product in this, sort of making the technology sort of help the product, uh, has probably been easier to do now than before, just because we've gained experience in that field. There's still sort of there was no transparency back then why the models suggested as they did. We tried to explain, and you remember the engineers from C-Sense tried to explain as well, but it didn't really resonate that well in the newsroom, who was like super skeptical. Um, but I mean, we still have to face some of the questions, the doubt, sort of the being being able to come into position to do automatic content recommendation uh, is still hard work. If there's anything changed, it's the newsrooms have become smaller, so there's fewer people to do that job. So they're happy getting some automation because they can't do everything. So if there's been change, it has to be like there.
I think also like one of the things going, I mean, already in 2016 when you started with this, and 2018 when I joined Seasons, the many of the user experiences in social media was sort of personalized in that case. But and then sort of like I think a push has been also that experiences are other parts. But one of the things that I always try to explain, for example, with personalization when I work with Newsroom, is we should not think about social media. We shouldn't create the social media part of news, because journalism is something completely different. But I want to keep on the track here about the newsroom, because I do agree with you. I think then if an editor-in-chief is not able to explain why some content was shown versus something else, you have a fundamental issue, because the biggest reason for readers coming to news this day, and where everybody's taking a bet now, is the trust it is having. And if you have a black box model that you're not able to explain, you're pretty much not having a trust in terms of what's being curated to the reader. So I think very often in newsrooms is that when we talk about personalization, we think about giving sort of like a social media personalization. But then what would you say are the biggest risk you see with personalization in news in terms of the editorial, the technical, or even the readers themselves, the audience?
That's a great question. It's a big one as well. So uh, the risks in the newsrooms is that they don't dare enough,
Hmm.
right? Because if you don't allow, you need content. You need a pool of content in able to give personalization a chance to do its job. If you have like 30 articles that you're allowed to go on the front page, you can do it manually, because there's sort of you can't do anything with it. It will have a limited effect. You probably need 300 to 400 articles, right? To really make a change. Maybe 150 will do quite a lot as well, but you need a lot of content. And that's usually the newsrooms, they are too tight on how up to date, up to time their front page or homepage should be. It shouldn't be older than 24 hours. It shouldn't be older than 6 hours, and sort of because they have this, they don't want it to feel outdated, but their perception of their product is different than their users' perception. So you kind of need to give that space. And then we have the technical limitations on how can we differentiate better on users who've been visiting recently or came like for 3 days ago. And how do we select that pool of articles, because they haven't been living on the rock for 3 days, right? Or been to the moon. They've probably been reading news somewhere else as well, even though they haven't been on your site for 3 days. So you can't give them stories that were 3 days old because they probably read them 3 days ago somewhere else as well. So you kind of there's this balance that we need to figure out, and that's a risk that we get lost in that process. I'm super skeptical to anyone who suggests segmentation,
Hmm.
and I think that urge or thought about personalization and segmentation comes from the advertising industry, because the advertising industry has been really good at targeting. And they also confuse targeting and personalization quite a lot, because they say personalization, but what they actually want is targeting, because they have sold exposure to a customer for a piece of content, an ad or a story or whatever, right? So they've sold it, said, here we have a pool of 25,000 users within your target group that fits your age and demography, age and gender, that lives in Kiruna or Stockholm or wherever. And then they push that towards those users and they say that's personalization, that's targeting, right? But these segmentation thoughts that we have from marketing and advertising kind of disturbs the whole way of thinking about personalization. So that's the risk here as well, that we are able to let that go. And then when you go to social media, which is the other best case that we have, is that those products are vastly different than the products that we serve in the media, because we are no way able to create something that can cater to doom scrolling. We have a limited amount of content available, and that should be fine, but we should still try to scope it as big as possible. So kind of only limiting ourselves to what we know on personalization from advertising or social media might lead us to miss sort of the target. I think we should do the hard work and try to define what personalization can be in media without sort of the bias of looking at those other two great examples. But sort of I think that there's something else that we need to figure out there.
I two thoughts of what you said, and one that sort of resonates with me pretty heavy. And I think I'm pretty guilty in terms of like this marketing part that you said in terms of the advertising. And one thing that I see is very many that's been in sort of advertising roles in news moved into sort of roles for personalization, and they have the same thinking when they do a segmentation. And very often, to also to listeners, very often it was a data management platform. You set up these segments and you said that this audience is unique. These are people are really interested into sports, and you sell that for a higher CPM, cost per mil in terms of the advertising industry. But interesting is that even though you call that audience unique, that audience in that segment by 90% is probably part of all the other segments in the DMP. There's no uniqueness to it. But as an industry, I think this has been a red flag for me, and I would say almost partly guilty of it as sort of being on the vendor side, how we sell it, but that's been the marketing case, and it's not talked about enough. The other part is also with, if we look into social media, as you said, is I think one part is the echo chamber, and then it just also has so much more content that is then generated by the users that news simply cannot do. But I would also create an analogy to a topic that's talked a lot about in the industry, and that is user needs. There's 4 very good user needs for news. It's update me, connect me, inspire me, or give me perspective. The biggest user need for social media is waste my time. Doom scroll, that's the number one you
Yeah.
would want to have, is that keep it. And the question is, do we want news to be the user need, waste my time in many ways? And I think it's defining journalism as it is. And those 2 points resonated with me. But then I have a specific question that I get a lot in terms of personalization. I'm keen on your perspective of how you work with the newsroom in answering this. Is one of the first thing I see, especially if we were to personalize the whole homepage. And by the way, listeners, I'm having a marketing headache in terms of if we say front page or homepage, because in the Nordics, we are very good at saying the front page, but the rest of the world say homepage. So if anybody wants to give suggestion, please send me a DM on what the right word, but let's say the homepage. Very often when you start personalizing, for example, the full homepage, I get the question by the editors, why is the story that I just published so far down the page, but Lisa that I work with is having it on row 3? How would you explain that to somebody who's getting that experience in terms of giving them the understanding of how automation personalization works?
So I think that's one of the big things that we still have to settle somehow. We haven't been working too hard on that because we've explained sort of, you don't see it because you have already read it, so it's sort of pushed further down. The system identifies you as having it read or seen it multiple times. This is normal, and then we try to show that the overall numbers, like we're using the dashboards and say like, right, so the last 5 minutes, X amount of people have seen it. You shouldn't be worried. They read it, right? But then there's value in being on the top of the page as well, since we don't have that doom scroll setup, but they're actually ordered of what's most important right now. That sort of sends a different signal. From an editorial journalistic standpoint, it can be fine that someone don't read the top story, but they should know that this is the top story at the moment, right? If it's a accident or if it's a royal scandal or the stock exchange is plummeting, or you don't have to read the story, but skimming through the homepage, you should be able to see what's most important now. So I we haven't solved the visualization part yet. I think we're going to work really hard on it in 26. Not sure how we're going to do it. I think that's a business opportunity for you guys to sort of solve that for the industry. I think that would be really, really nice. We have some ideas, uh, but they're really hard to scale as well.
I want to keep on the track here in terms of the question I just had in terms of how you explain it. For example, this I get asked a lot by the editorial team, and today's podcast I also want to be about a lot of the learnings that you sit on, because I think you're one of the persons in I would say the world that been encountering a lot of this how to do personalization. And talking about one thing that we see is that 80% of the clicks happens on the top. That's really basically where the majority of the readership is. Further down you go, you have less readers and you're catering to a smaller part of the audience. So by default, the higher you can come up on the homepage, the better the results are. But then I'm just interested into when you introduce a system like Curate, where do you typically start on the page, saying that you would have a brand new news that you would start with, and how do you move from that position and gradually up on the homepage?
All right, so that now we're also discussing the implementation strategies here. So typically you would only get access to the bottom of the page. I mean, some start with the widgets, right? And I think the widgets, they aren't really that interesting because they accumulate for a very, very small part of the engagement. So we came into the main feed already when they started to build Curate in 16, way before my time. So they started thinking about automation, not personalization, but automation. And they started at the bottom. So the last 10 rows, last 5 rows. And over time, increasing sort of automated positions incrementally over time, making sure that the newsroom knows that, all right, so if we let these fixed positions that we're manually editing go, we can improve engagement. And by letting the system A/B test and letting the system sort of try to beat the manual curation, you kind of eat your way up on the site. But then what we've learned is that given the design on the page, given the size, given the traffic, given the type of site, you encounter different types of problems, different business cases. Is it a metered site? Is it a freemium site? Is it a fully open site? So you have these type of challenges that you need to fix, business cases, while you're eating your way up to get uh, the biggest amount of volume that you can get of impressions through the automation. It's about sort of how do you divide the amount of impressions that you have in total on fixed and automatic positions, right? And you need to strike that balance here as well. Do you solve all the business cases? Do you solve the editorial cases? What happens if there's a big tragedy and they need the top 10 positions to cover that tragedy? These things happen, so you need to be prepared for those things as well. So, but overall, it's about starting at the bottom and working your way up with the newsroom so they feel safe, they feel that they're taken care of, their needs are taken care of, and they have less manual work to do. And in the beginning, sort of midway up, they're just happy because they have less things that they need to worry about and they can focus on the right things, setting the right image, the right title. They have some type of visualization so they can see that, all right, this is working, this is sort of how we expect it to be. And that would be sort of the number one strategy. Incrementally, start at the bottom because when this works, it will work itself.
And I think for the people of us that work with personalization, the number one rap song that we listen to is Drake, Started from the Bottom, Now We're Here. That is basically the song that we live by every inch that we get higher up. But then my question is, why is it so much harder to personalize the very top of the page compared to further down?
Right. So depending on how high up you're thinking about. So
Let's say the very top.
the word top 1, top 2, top 3.
Yeah.
So yeah, uh, there's a lot of editorial decisions on what should be number 1, number 2, and number 3. I would say up to top 5, lots of editorial decisions, and these editorial signals have to be very, very strong for an automated position to understand that this story is super duper important. It's not performing really well, so the performance metrics cannot lift it. It has some other metrics that's saying that this is important. So the easiest part is to say, easiest way to solve it is to say, this story, position number 1, until I release it, fixed. And when the editor releases it, it can go somewhere else. That's the easiest part, right? And then you can also say, all right, we do an editorial ranking system, right? We use actively these editorial signals, and the editors placing something is a type of signal. We are discussing use cases now. Can we show one top story to one specific user group and one other top story for another user group in some of the time, not always, but some of the time? We have some of our sites, they have they are local but also national. So when they have these big local stories, they want to have them on top, but that they're not really relevant for the national ones, right? So, and for them to grow, they kind of need to cater to both. And how to solve that? We haven't yet. I think we can solve it, but it's there's a lot of complexity into this. And then we see as well, you need data, you need warm up. Should you do warm up on position number 4, or should you do warm up on position number 7 or 10 maybe? Where should you do the explore? Where should you do the expose if you're doing bandits? Should you use those impressions wisely? Because if you start to waste like impressions on the highest positions to news stories for them just to warm up fast, that's probably not a good strategy on a position that should drive your engagement, where you should have um, exploits,
I
right?
also, yeah, on the point here is also the editorial team is also in the part of building trust. And I think from the top, it needs to be something that's general for everybody. I think it's you that's used the example of a bonfire. Do you just
Yeah.
want to tell that to the readers? Like, I think that's a brilliant thinking in terms of what the top and your analogy with a bonfire.
Yes. So social media, for example, that's not the bonfire. It's all about you. Absolutely all about you. Um, but we have traditionally, we've had the newspapers, we've had bonfires, we've had these things where we come together and we know that the topic is on the agenda. It's again with the top stories that you may like them, you don't read them, um, y- but you should know that they are on the top of the agenda for your peers, whether it's in the lunchtime at work or it's when you're meeting your neighbor at fetching the mail, right? Um, so this we have these brands especially, and I think all publications to some extent is like a bonfire as well within their segments. We have like Shifter, which we recently sold, right? But they're like a local newspaper for the startup industry, and they should somehow be the bonfire for that group of people. We have VG, which is the Norwegian biggest brand, right? And they serve the purpose of being the Norwegian bonfire. If there's a big, every Saturday, usually they have this big story that they break, right? And that should be the bonfire for the Saturday. But we also see that we have that from television, right? So we have television channels as well, which have like Dancing with the Stars and all of these big Maskorama. What's it called in England?
I have no clue, but how should I
Uh,
explain it? It's people hiding under a mask singing,
yeah,
and you guess who the celebrity is.
yeah, but you have these bonfires like everywhere, and that purpose is also important for all our brands to do, and you can't really solve that with personalization. That's the opposite of personalization, and we need to identify which stories should be the bonfire stories and how do we distribute them, because that's goes into the content recommendation. It's about distributing the content, right? So that's the complexity into it. But the analogy of bonfire isn't exactly mine, but I like it. I like it a lot as well.
I thought it was genius, and then I think it's also being able to have the editorial feeling part that not necessarily overriding the algorithm, but they have the final say on what sort of everybody sees. But then there's one role here that you've been dealing a lot with. I see a lot, and there's a lot of honor in this role that I call deskers. So the desk editors, those curating the homepage. big identity in terms of what they front the headline with, how they curate the homepage, and as more of the page becomes automated, maybe let's take away personalization, but automated. What happens to sort of the traditional roles of the desk editors? I mean, still we need editorial judgment, but then how does that role change now and for the future with more automation?
So I think there's a big opportunity to use that resource to enhance the editorial work in the journalism. I mean, there's even though something's published today, there's still lots of things that we can do with it. So when we move into liquid content, for example, the different versions of a story, should you see it as video or should you see it as text, long text, short text? Do you need a different tone of voice than your neighbor? And then we have the different the teasers, like we call it the teasers. It's it's a combination of title and image on the homepage, where we do A/B testing today. And when we do A/B testing, we choose the one that has the highest engagement score, and sometimes to choose one that has a lower engagement score because they see it's engaging well in some underserved user groups. So that's how sort of they try to balance that. But I think in the future, optimizing the content to get the reach and the full potential that the story can have in terms of reach will be sort of the opportunity here for the deskers, because they have a competence and a knowledge. We often talk about it as sort of the implicit knowledge that these people have. They see a story and they just know that it will work. Or they can see a story and say, need to change this and this, and it will work. So that's a competence that will be needed. Maybe we'll use AI or something as well, but these people, they will trim it and they will read the picture better than the rest, right? They know that right now that there's a soccer game going on, or that there's the finale on something on TV, or it's raining outside, or it's about to snow tomorrow. So they know what the people talk about, and sort of the bonfire, what they should talk about in the bonfire. So there's lots of opportunity in that role. And I think it will be more exciting in the future than what it is today, even though it's very often a very powerful position in the newsroom. They they if we're being like a bit sarcastic on it, that they act sort of as a Julius Caesar with the thumbs up, thumbs down, right, on the stories, and because they have a lot of influence on what can get exposure or not and be read. They just know. So that competence will be super important, but in a different way than what it's being used today.
And it's definitely on, like, this is where the top is so important, and having that sort of, they have the gut feeling in terms of like, what do we do with this? How do we promote it? That's still going to be as relevant. But then for the reasons that you said, I mean, I believe from experience that many deskers see sort of like something like Curate, something like automation, something like this as a threat. Would you would speak them to those things, such as they still are going to be important in terms of what they have from before and so on? How do you, for somebody who sees it definitely as a threat, how do you go by a conversation like that?
It's usually talking about the future and the vision of where we're going and what kind of skills they have, which is important. I mentioned some things here that I think that they'll do. So it's kind of that's how we're going to use your unique competence that no one else has and no one else can do better than you. And sort of that's things that will be needed. The things that you're doing now is you're too good to do what you're doing now. You shouldn't have to do what you're doing now. Uh, so I think yes, there's a lot of skepticism. But I mean, it's a big change and it goes into identity as well. And I have like super respect for anything touching a person's identity. I've seen it over the years so many times, if it's a merger or if it's a change of roles and sort of they need to explain to their neighbors and their family what they do for a living and sort of they can't really explain it themselves anymore, right? Because it's completely different and there's something that someone else doesn't have an understanding and relation of. Just saying that I manage the homepage of the biggest sites in Norway or the Aftenposten or Aftonblad in Sweden is like that's a super strong identity. If you can't explain what you do because there's an algorithm that did it, I understand that sort of you're allowed to be skeptic.
Yeah,
If you hadn't
100%.
been skeptic, I'd be skeptic.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I think it goes to. We need to be able to sort of explain how the model works, because if you're able to do that, it's easier to also articulate and tell. Goes back to trust again, also for the
Yeah.
readers, like to be able to how it's then set up. But then we talked about sort of like where you start on the front page, if it's below article and so on. One thing we already done is to sort of clarify marketing mythbusters almost with segmentation. And there's another one that you and me talked a little bit on the prep for this, is sort of a little bit of the CTR myth in the industry.
Mm.
And one of the things is that in very many presentations we see in the industry, and again, I think product owners, me, the software vendors and so, we're sort of a little bit guilty, because there's a lot of these presentations where it said, we enabled this model, we did this widget, and it had 3 to 200% increase in CTR, click-through rate. And when you look further at it, it's then a widget that's row 20 on the homepage. As we explained, most of the clicks happen on the top, and you're catering to a lower there. One thing that I find interesting is that if you were to look at, for example, the CTR on the whole homepage, if you do personalization far down on the homepage, and let's say that 60% of all readers coming to a homepage clicked an article as an overall. If you do personalization farther down and you have a great number, it's 300%, my CTR overall is still going to be 60 in this. I mean, isn't those sort of numbers misleading? And you think that, but I also get that we do that as a way to start one place to move ourselves up in this. But I find as an industry, it's completely misleading in many ways.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And uh, it it takes a long time to see the big shift in sort of the long KPIs, the long numbers. We have lots of short numbers, which is CTR. We can do an A/B test and we can see that it works really, really fast. The long numbers, do you increase subscribers? Do the right user group engage more over time? And there's a complexity here with the news coverage and just how what's going on in the world, which is also affecting us. But so the biggest driver for traffic is journalism. Big happenings, big things that happens in good journalism is the biggest driver for engagement and traffic, right? So we can't sort of what personalization can do on top of that is limited. We need to have that, and sort of that's the reality.
Hmm.
So when we introduce these things and seeing that it actually has an effect on these longer KPIs is really, really hard. We've managed to do it now with some researchers from University of Klagenfurt in Austria, um, which I think is like finally we have something where we can prove that yes, this does have an effect on the longer things. We've had a bet. We've said, all right, if we are able to increase the engagement short term, it's like the leap of faith, right? From lean startup.
Hmm.
Our leap of faith has been if we can improve the engagement, this will impact our longer KPIs. Now we've proven that it does. Still very general, might be cases where it doesn't, but from what Marlene did from the University of Klagenfurt did as a research in one of our brands show that this does have an effect. And then I hear you, and I get a bit of a smirky smile as well when I see these numbers. I'm probably guilty of publishing some of these numbers as well. And are they misleading? I wouldn't call them misleading, but then again, because they did have a big impact. Norway is a country of ski jumpers, right? We're proud old nation of ski jumpers, and we have this saying in Norway that you don't want to jump after Wirkola, which was a great ski jumper. And the story is that no one wanted to jump after Wirkola because no one can jump longer than him, and everyone that jumped after Wirkola seemed like a poor ski jumper. Funny thing is that my uncle is actually one of the jumpers that came after Wirkola because they trained together as kids. But then I had, and that's a solid Norwegian saying, right? But I had a boss once, an editor in Östlendingen, and he said, Christoph, you have to remember, you're not always jumping after Wirkola. Sometimes you're also jumping after Ed Eagle. So I think when we're doing these widgets and these things that have been overseen for a long time, that's the Eddie the Eagle. Great character, by the way, but not that great results. So that's the Eddie the Eagle of our homepages. It's not that hard to get good results, and then we see these obscene numbers sometimes. And I think that also goes into the shift of the culture, showing that, hey, if we do this down there, where we get 300% increase in engagement, imagine what we can do somewhere else, right? So that's also the thing that we need to push for in our industry to make this change happen fast enough.
Yeah, and it's a way to sort of get to that next row, the next row, the next row. The overall thing that I think is just, if we look at sort of the overall part, is that the higher you go up, the bigger the results. But it's a big learning exercise to start with somewhere and then look into it. But I feel very often like the industry is now focused on the 200 to 300% numbers, and that's maybe not necessarily, if you look at the whole picture, where the real part is then moving the needle. But I completely agree. It's part of then getting further up as a way to get then everybody along. Is that the research you mentioned, by the way, public available?
I think there's some preprints that has been published, but it's sent for review, so we expect it to be published.
Okay, in that case, if it's available, I'll make sure to link that to the listeners for them to see it. But I want to move into, and you mentioned a little bit of a word here, liquid content, which has been talked about on the podcast and is a big part here in the industry. And on the part here is that if we now move the conversation from where story appears, which Curate is focusing on, what about we start thinking about how it appears? So not where, but how. Liquid content is this new phenomena. Can you talk about this, and is this an area that you look into in Curate now?
Yeah. So if we try to define liquid content, it is having a piece of journalism displayed in different formats. It could be text, sound, video, short, long, different variants of that same. Some newsrooms even call it just different variants, basically, instead of liquid content, or it has loads of different names, but that's sort of the essence of it. It's different variants of the same content. And we have started to discuss it, and we've actually discussed it for a while. The concept of it, we've started to explore with different types of content. So we have an amazing AI lab in Schibsted who has done great work on turning articles into videos, and it works super smooth. So that would be one format. We've done text to speech for a while. We've trained our voices on the podcasters and the voices of the newsroom, and then they're automatically taken from text to speech. I wouldn't say that's a perfect type of content, because still, even though it's the voices are good, it still feels like having someone read the newspaper for you, so it's not super sexy. But I think with the AI and the opportunities that comes here, we can start to generate different formats, like cost and scale efficient. When we do that, we can start to explore within this space. But unless we have that, that's like the super blocker that we have. We need at least like, I would say we'd need 3 to 4 different formats of the same story before this becomes really interesting. We can start to play around with it, that's fine, but before it becomes really interesting. And then I'm not sure if Curate is the one that should do the recommendation on that, or if it's a different layer in the stack that we have. So we can say that this story is interesting for you, but what format you get it in will be probably someone else, maybe someone else.
But the case is also like, if we talk about the word personalization as a term, it's so broad, because personalization can today be dynamic paywalls. It can be where the content is coming, is liquid content and so on. But then,
Dark
like,
mode,
look,
light mode. How do
yeah,
you get your menu, right?
exactly. It's so many different things. But then looking ahead, like, Schibsted is taking a big position, always been sort of like really forward moving in the space. And what does the next stage of personalization look like for Schibsted, and what do you think also for the global market more in broadly? You mentioned liquid content. What do you think is the next thing there, and things you're looking into?
And there's a lot of things that we're dealing with right now. So I think liquid content definitely interesting. I think we have some of the personalization, the models that we need to solve with different approaches than collaborative filtering.
Hmm.
It is done as well, but we've sort of met the limitation of what we can do with it now. And we still haven't solved. We're really good at articles, but we're not that great on video. We're not that great on audio. But there's things going on sort of with embeddings and sort of AI and everything that allows us to do different types or more modern approaches to personalization than what we've been able to. So I think we still have a long way to go on just recommending the right piece of journalism before we start to play around with the different formats.
There's multiple things here, but if for you, which experiment or project around personalization that you are doing are you most excited about right now?
Uh, I'm 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 so dumb. I'm excited of just getting up in the morning and start to deal with this whole scope. So it's kind of really hard to pick just one thing that I want to mention here. I mean, it's I'm like super lucky because I work in a place like Schibsted, and as I said, we do a lot of crazy things that
Mm.
is like super inspiring. But I can't really just pick one thing and drop here, I think. I mean, yeah, we have some models that are like really, really promising on picking out recommendations fast and super accurate.
Can
Yeah.
on that, in terms of the models, one thing that I haven't asked about, like, if somebody is considering setting up like a personalization team like Curate, how does your team look like? Like, those setting up models and so on, what does a team like that look like?
So yeah, so Curate is quite complex because we have the front end part for the journalists, so that the tool that they're using, drag and drop stories and sort of edit the teasers and selecting content. There's some self-service to adjust the pools, configuring the different outputs. Then we have a back end, of course, and we have some machinery that needs to run. But we also have a great deal of data piping going on and processing. We even have quite a lot of Java processes running just because they're like super efficient and stable, and so it's a big team. And then we have machine learning engineers, we have MLOps, we have data engineers, we have data scientists, we have UXers. So we have a big team with lots of roles. Although I think we're 13, 14 people. So we have lots of roles that needs to be covered. But that goes sort of in, we do content recommendation, and machine learning and personalization is one part of content recommendation. If you want to do personalization only, you could probably do that somewhere else, some different way, but for us, that's just a part that goes into the overall content recommendation. And we're like super agnostic as well, so we don't we could serve on any platform that we would like to, because there's a different layer and different team that sort of does the output.
And one of the things that's interesting with Schibsted where you work is also multiple brands, multiple formats. There's so much in terms of where this is going. But then if you were to, for everyone who's listening through the whole conversation, and I think a lot has been coming to this point because it's really a lot of good learnings here, what is one change in how they think about content recommendation that you would hope that they sit after and think about after our conversation? What's maybe a learning that you made that you think is worth for listeners?
It's a marathon that consists of lots of sprints. So start small and increment.
Christoph, this has been super fantastic and lots of learnings from this. And we have a closing tradition in the podcast that the previous guest gets to leave a question for the next one. The previous guest I had on the podcast was Dominic, who is then leading paid content in Süddeutsche. And he had a question. How do you measure whether your journalism provides enough value to give people the feeling of being informed, not just the content itself? And how do you know that feeling is strong enough to justify paying for it?
Yes, I think what makes that question difficult to answer is the part of feeling being informed. I would take like a leap of faith there and say, if they come back and they use you more, they are feeling informed. If they weren't feeling informed, if the user need is, and the strongest user need, I'm a bit skeptical to all of these different user needs. I think the biggest user needs is, I want to be informed. That's the number one for our news sites, at least. So if they feel that they are being informed, they will come back. If they don't feel, they will not come back. So that would be sort of the leap of faith. And if it's strong enough to justify paying for it, it's the same. If they churn, then it's not justifiable. Then you've done something wrong. If they keep paying for that subscription and keep using you, it's justified. It's a happy customer. Yeah.
Christoph, you also get to ask a question for the next guest, not knowing who that is. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm like, anyone who has a good idea on how to visualize a personalized homepage for the newsroom, please give me some input.
Can you go more into detail, like visualize like how it should appear?
Yeah, I mean, if it's like the front page editors, the homepage editors, they drag and drop stories, and the story is personalized, so everyone's seeing a different page. How do you visualize for them what's being exposed on the homepage? How do we give them the transparency that they can say and lean back and sort of, because they've used to have the paper newspaper, right? And they put it on desk and say, I did this yesterday. It looks like this, and everyone gets this. I know exactly how that page looks, and everyone can come and say, we can discuss how that page looks. How can we recreate that feeling for a personalized homepage where everyone gets a different homepage experience, but that editor can lean back and say, I know exactly what's being displayed on my homepage?
That's a brilliant question. I'll make sure to bring it into the next guest. Thank you so much, Christoph, for doing this.
Thank you. This has been really, really fun. Thank you for having me.